When you have an engine with poor reliability, ironically, it drives up the value of that engine. Why?
Yeah,
Because
yeah.
This is the Time on Wing podcast. Welcome back. I'm Courtney Miller with Visual Approach Analytics. As always, joining me, Garrick Deschavon of the Collateral Verifications. Garrick, who are we talking to today?
Hey, Courtney, what's going on? Again, that's right. See, you just gave it away. Gave it away. We've got the fabulous Shannon Ackert, who is going to wow us with his knowledge once again. Shannon is currently SVP at Jackson Square Aviation. He was VP at Macquarie Air Finance, Director at GATX Capital Corp. He is a regular lecturer for the ISTAT PDP Aircraft Maintenance Economics. He's also part of the curriculum for the development for the ISTAT University. He was a member of the Aircraft Leasing Advisory Group for IATA. He's got a bachelor's in aeronautical engineering from Embry-Riddle Aeronautical University, and he's got an MBA from the University of San Francisco. We are super excited today because he is going to talk to us about his book, which is Insights for Aviation Business Professionals. And anybody who wants to know anything about aviation should definitely go out and buy it. It's on Amazon. You can just go out and get it. It is definitely worth it. So I'm getting mine today. Very excited. So anyway, it's going to be another great discussion. So Shannon, this is your time on wing. Again. So before we get on with our guest, which you guys are going to absolutely love, we obviously, first of all, we want to thank all our listeners for listening to us and making the show what it is today. And we certainly welcome any of you to, whenever you see us at conferences, just please say hello. And we'd love to hear that you guys are listening and fans of the show. As you all know, we do run businesses. And so from my end at Collateral Verifications, on the appraisal side, right, obviously, if you have any needs when it comes to aircraft, engine, landing gear, you name it, right, just please feel free to reach out. I'm very approachable. I'm happy to chat about any kind of projects, and we'd love to work with you on variety of things. We do have some publications out there as well. I do Turbine Aircraft Guide, Turboprop Value Guide. I've got the Aircraft Rating Tool. So there's various publications that we put together that can kind of help you on your day-to-day. Great reference points. So definitely, kind of reach out to us, and we'd love to chat and kind of start that relationship with you.
Okay, back to the show.
Well, Shannon, thank you again for kind of joining us. We loved having you on last time, so we're looking forward to a great discussion this time around. And the big thing for you right now is you've just launched a book called The Insights for Aviation Business Professionals, and we'd love to hear kind of how that came about in terms of where the inspiration came from and what the thought was behind it and what it's all about. So take it away.
Great. Thank you. First of all, thank you very much for being on the podcast again. It's always a pleasure. So the origins of the book, how it all came about was really inspired by this lack of sort of knowledge that many people here in the financier community have regarding aircraft performance characteristics. So if you look at our focus, it's largely predicated on valuations and the financing components of it, the interest rates, the cost of funds, and so forth. And the aircraft characteristics that play a role in financing are largely the market value, the future-based value, the residual values, and so forth. In my view, there was sort of a lack of understanding regarding what drives an airline to select an aircraft, what motivates them. And what I thought I'd do was kind of put myself in their position and try to highlight the key characteristics of an aircraft that really drive an airline's motivation and their decision making as well. So that was kind of the genesis of it. And I thought by bringing this book into the market, those individuals that want to take a leap of faith and dive into this material, I think will gain a fuller appreciation of what inspires an airline to select airplanes. And also there are components in the book that address characteristics that do influence valuations. For example, when we talk about weights and when we talk about thrust, those are the kind of the high-level specification adjusters that we factor in our valuation. But beyond that, we don't really delve into a lot of other characteristics that influence the performance of an aircraft. So, yeah, that was the genesis of it all, and it was a learning experience for me. I got to delve into a lot of these topics in more granularity, and I learned a lot as well. So it was a great experience. But insofar as how the book is broken out, it's really two sections. The first 4 chapters address the aircraft characteristics that influence performance. Chapter 1 addresses largely the weight characteristics. So you get into discussions about the maximum design structural weights. These are the engineering design limits that are set for each of the major weight groups, representing the maximum takeoff weight, the maximum zero fuel weight, maximum landing weight, maximum taxi weight. So there's a structural design limit for each of those weight categories. And then you have certified weight limits, which are the limits that airlines focus on, because not every airline is going to need the maximum structural design limits. Many airlines decide what kind of limitations that they will choose from based on their operating environment, their network. So the certified limits often reflect the nature of the airline's network, not examples being in Europe. A lot of airlines, particularly with narrow body airplanes, they don't go for the maximum takeoff weights or the maximum zero fuel weights. And the reason why is because, for example, landing fees and navigation fees in Europe are quite high, and they're indexed to the maximum takeoff weight. So they're more, airlines in Europe tend to be a little bit more discerning about the weight categories that they pick for their operation. And other topics that the book gets into. Chapter 2 deals with capacities. This was an area that is quite interesting in the sense that we're all aware of payload capacities and how we can adjust the levers for the different types of capacity levels that an airline may desire. Some want mainline, 3 class, 2 class, some want high density. So the main levers that you have there are largely, seat pitch and in the case of wide bodies, seats to breast. But another characteristic that allows you to influence the capacity of the airplanes are the exit doors. And so this was, in my experience, it has been a characteristic of an aircraft that largely gets ignored internally here, and a lot of times in the financier community, we don't really take exit doors into consideration. We learn after the facts, for example, and I think you can relate to this, but in the case of wide-body airplanes like the 767 and the A330, where you have the optional Type A doors, a lot of airlines, leisure operators, ACMI, charter operators, we found out when we were transferring airplanes in the secondary market that the greatest demand for those airplanes really came from those types of airlines, and those specific airlines really wanted the Type A plus doors in order to maximize the capacity for their type of operation. So that was kind of an eye-opener that we discovered, and we just recently closed a transaction with an airline on the A330-900 that had a Type A plus door. And one of the conversations that we had internally about the aircraft was the exit door, and how this consensus was that when this airplane comes off lease, that demand for this airplane would probably be more robust because because of that configuration. Most airlines that we've seen in the secondary market today that are absorbing used A330s are charter, leisure, ACMI operators. And then we move on to fuel capacity. That's another feature that has really garnered a lot of attention, particularly with the A321neo, where they have made that aircraft extremely versatile through the optionality of selecting between, one up to 3 auxiliary fuel tanks. So that's another lever that you have to influence the performance characteristics of the aircraft. And then lastly, we get into the cargo capacity. And incidentally, as you probably can infer if you've gone through the book really quickly, I do dedicate quite a bit of material to freighter airplanes. And the reason why I did that was largely because, today, particularly production freighters, they're very instrumental for a lot of mainline carriers that have subsidiary operators that are dedicated cargo freight operators. So when you look at, for example, a wide body, unbeknownst to us at the time, there's an optional large cargo door. And so we sort of disregarded it when we first acquired 777-300ERs, but lo and behold, you find out when you're transferring these airplanes in the secondary market, people are asking about that. Do you have the large cargo door? So that was a feature that really enhanced the versatility of the airplane. And then ironically, now that the 777 is going through a P2F program today, guess what? A lot of the airlines want to have that large cargo door on their 777s as a way to boost or offer flexibility in transporting all various types of cargo pallets and containers as well. So that was an interesting characteristic of an airplane that I kind of discovered by accident. So moving on into chapter 3, you get into the payload capabilities of the airplane. And here's where I dedicated a lot of time to the freighter categories, where, passenger airplanes operating at max structural payloads is very rare. When you look at how airplanes are marketed today on the passenger front, people are focusing largely on the design range, right? So the range that really corresponds to the maximum payload capacity of that airplane. That is nowhere near the maximum structural payload capability. But with freighters, we quote the range at max structural payload. So every time we have the OEMs in here, that's what they highlight. They highlight the range at max structural payload for freighters. And so the need to highlight that capability was very, in my opinion, critical to the understanding of freighter aircraft, was to break down payload capacities, not necessarily just max structural payload, but volume limit payload as well. So the contrast between max structural payload and volume limit payload is important today, because obviously e-commerce types of operations warrant the volume, and production freighters are largely focused on high density type of cargo, and so you want max structural capabilities for those as well. So that is highlighted heavily in chapter 3. Chapter 4.
On that really quick, so at DHL we would call that just loading efficiency, right? Because we're actually loading boxes into containers, and this drives so much, right? Because it's very difficult to understand volumetric. We think of it in terms of containers as opposed to the amount of packages, but when you're trying to assign revenue, it gets difficult, and then you get to the actual efficiency. And I asked, what do you mean by loading efficiency? And they said, see that guy over there? He has to stack boxes, literally, by himself. And by the way, he can't just stack them all straight because they could tip over. So you have to brick them, right? I mean, there's a method to it, right? So that it won't just tip over on them. And he has to do that. And by the way, these are rounded containers usually.
Yeah.
And they're square boxes. So you just lose a little bit there. And then you add in that these boxes tend to be lighter, right? So there's no way we could even get to structural payload in the express market other than GE shows up with an engine and says, hey, can you move this? And right, there's one thing that kind of blows it out. Then you have floor loading limitations.
Exactly.
Right. So there are all these different limitations that you hit. And when you're evaluating an aircraft, what I find most interesting, and again, this applies to the express world, the only number you actually have is payload. It's weight.
Yes, exactly. And you brought up revenue payload, and that's a characteristic of freighter airplanes that has to be accounted for, because you have obviously max structural payload, but you're carrying the tare weight of all the containers, which is not, you can't monetize that weight. So you have to deduct it from the max structural payload, and the result is your revenue payload. And then you address the running loads. Freighters have different running load limitations, and what often distinguishes a really good freighter from another is how they are able to address their high density cargo along the interior, and each section of the airplane has limitations, and so how you load that airplane is going to be a function of the running load limitations of each of those sections. And so a cargo airplane, a really efficient one, typically has really good running load limitations in their airplanes as well. So that was a good eye-opener. I learned a lot from that as well. Incidentally, it wasn't a category that I was well versed in, so I had to kind of dig a little deeper into that.
That's so typical Shannon Ackert, though. I mean, come on, the whole airline monitor was, if I remember from our first podcast, the whole airline monitor, all these papers that you wrote originally weren't because you're like, hey, I have something I need to teach you. It was, hey, I want to learn more about this, and this is how I learn about it, which is genius. I have used that example so many times talking to new people in the industry, like, how do I learn this? I said, write something.
Exactly.
Because you'll learn it.
Exactly. Yeah, and I learned quite a bit writing this book, and I geeked out a lot too.
Yeah, of course.
I'll talk about that later, but one of the chapters that I think was very critical was chapter 4, which dealt with the engines. And
yes,
you know, the reason why I say it's critical is today the topic of conversation revolves around reliability and durability of these engines, these new tech engines. And it's come to the fore where a lot of airlines today are complaining about the reliability. Largely, you know, just for your audience sake, you know, reliability is the ability to manage uninterrupted delays and cancellations. So when you have good reliability, you minimize that. And what we're seeing today, in conjunction with some of the manufacturing discrepancies that we see on the Pratt & Whitney engines, is you just have a high premature removal rates of these engines. Now, when we get talking later on, if we talk about some of the issues that I'm focused on in the future, that's an issue that parlays into engine values, and I'll break into that in more detail. But just quickly, when you have an engine with poor reliability, ironically, it drives up the value of that engine. Why?
Yeah,
because
each hour is now more value.
Still demand driven, right? That's values are directly correlated to demand, right? So
exactly. And then on the flip side, you talk about durability. So durability is more like achieving that scheduled time on wing expectation that the manufacturers have established. So when you get long time on wing, here we go.
This is why we don't do this show with alcohol, Shannon.
Anyways, when you get that long time on wing, effectively, when you have a durable engine, the unknown today with the new technology engines is, because these engines are operating under extreme higher pressures, higher temperatures, is that we're beginning to see that some of these outlier engines that are operating in benign environments that had achieved their durability expectations, those engines have had really high shop visit costs, way above the initial expectation. So understanding those concepts, which we address in the book, is kind of critical today, and you'll begin to appreciate the dynamics between those two variables more so today than you have in the past. We didn't deal with reliability issues on the 7Bs and 5Bs. We didn't have those discussions. We have those discussions today to the extent that it's really influenced to some extent how we're going to price airplanes in the future, or how we're going to decide whether there's arbitrage opportunities, because the values of the engines keep escalating, not only because of inflation, but also because of the artificial demand imposed on them through poor reliability, and so forth.
It's like the perfect crime, right? You build a new engine and then you just make it everybody's shooting for reliability, but I like how you separate that from durability. You don't make it very durable. It's the old model, right? It's the old plastic plastic model. You got to replace it more. But what's interesting is it does increase the value, because now value is more attached to green time, and we've said that before. But just the available hours that this engine can actually push the airplane forward.
Exactly. Yeah, it's a very interesting dynamic. I'm glad I brought that up. And then very quickly, I sort of branch into the second half of the book, which deals more with operational characteristics of the airplane that influence its performance. And, we go into, for example, field length and the restrictions imposed on airplanes as a result of hot environments, hot and high environments. A lot of airlines, particularly in Latin America, make their decision on the basis of the capability of airplanes operating in these hot and high types of environments. We've got customers that with Boeing airplanes, they all select the bump thrust option. They want the bumps because there are circumstances where they need that to get out of high altitude environments, or they always select the maximum thrust available for that option, for that aircraft type. So I think that was a really good topic when you have to justify how airlines pick airplanes in these types of environments, particularly in Latin America, the Middle East, and parts of Africa. A lot of it is based on the airline's capability of operating out of these types of challenging environments. So that was a discussion that I really got a lot of excitement about. And then, of course, we got into the payload range performance characteristics of the airplane. I went one step further in that chapter to expand on circle charts and highlight the seat range diagrams. But, there's caveats when you're looking at this information. A lot of it is OEM driven. There's caveats to each one of those.
Oh, yeah.
And you have to be mindful that it's a tool, it's an instrument that a lot of OEMs use to market their airplanes. So when you absorb this data from the OEMs, you have to be mindful that there's sort of I won't say an exaggerated element to it, but there's certainly a focus on highlighting performance characteristics of the airplanes to a degree that you normally, oftentimes what I wanted to say is it can be influenced. It can be influenced based on the assumptions that you build into the data that goes into the circle charts, or the data that goes into the payload range diagram, right? You've seen payload range diagrams from one OEM that compares it to their competitor. You bring in the other OEM and they'll show you their payload range diagrams with their competitors, and it's completely flipped. Like they're showing their airplanes in a better.
And they're done that.
Yeah. Funny how that works. Huh?
We've all seen that. So
yeah.
So
and
anyway.
the trick, so I mean, I'm gonna end up going a couple chapters back here. You mentioned LOPAs, right? When you're talking aircraft performance, when you're talking airfield performance, when you're talking just payload range,
Yeah.
the common where all that starts is actually in the LOPA. I think, in fact, I was talking with Daniel Lazare from Castle Lake the other day, who used to do a lot of work in the sales engineering for Airbus on the LOPAs. And we were just talking about how so much starts with the LOPA. From the OEM perspective, it's not that we're fudging numbers or that they're fudging numbers. It's that they're making sure that every metric maximizes, is selected, whether it be the LOPA, whether it be thrust or temperature assumptions or wind assumptions. And we might think that, oh, yeah, just the least amount of wind, the better. No, or cruise speed. That was always one that drove me absolutely bonkers. Yeah. The cruise speed difference between the CRJ and the E-jets is substantial. The CRJ was much, much faster just in cruise. What value is that? Maybe not. Depends on the airline. So you're always you're assigning the variables that make you look better. They're not just adding margin or removing it.
Absolutely right. And other characteristics that can really distinguish an airplane is the time from takeoff to cruise altitude. You take an airplane that can save 10 minutes to cruise altitude. That's a lot of fuel. But that doesn't get captured in the payload range diagram or in the circle charts. So you always have to caveat the implications of this data and what it means. So obviously it's a good reference to kind of understand the limitations of the airplane, the performance limitations. But there are certainly other features in an airplane that can sway the decision that doesn't get reflected in that data quite often.
We call those decisions the big red phone. Just the one that rings, and the prime minister of the country says, "Hey, I just talked to the CEO of Airbus, and guess what we're buying."
Yeah, it might not even
There's no number to
anything
that.
Related to that. Anything related to performance. It might be just numbers,
Yeah.
And we've seen that too. There's no question about it. And availability today, if you think about it, you can't get a 320 till early 2030s. You can't get a 737 MAX till the end of the decade. So sometimes availability is going to dictate what you buy today.
Mm-hmm. The whole book is just shy of 400 pages, right?
Yeah.
And you just talked about probably 1,200 pages worth of content, right? that worth, like that's the type of, getting deeper into engines, the aircraft selection process, cruise speed, climb, time to climb, all these type of things. Like there's such a deep. There's so many deep levels. You could have written a book for each one of these chapters. So I don't know how you condensed it. Well done. To all the really good stuff.
Believe it or not, my favorite chapter was chapter 8. That's where I geeked out. I got to kind of go back to my aero engineering background and bring out some of the metrics that we talk about, like aspect ratio and lift to drag ratios and so forth. But I try to explain it more in layman's term. But the essence of chapter 8, and I thought, in my opinion, it segues into the discussions we're having today regarding the next next generation single aisle airplane. It segues perfectly into it, because when you look at the leap in efficiency that we're demanding today for the next single aisle generation airplane, it has to be high double digits. It's going to have to be 20+%. So when you look at the designs that are on the drawing boards today, they're not only focused on the engine performance, the fuel performance of the Rise or the UltraFan or the next generation GTF, but for the first time in generation, it's going to focus on the aerodynamics of the airframe, contributing to a significant impact on fuel burn efficiency. So long, slender wings, high aspect ratio wings, we see that characteristic in the 787-9. And we've seen evidence of how Boeing and Airbus are focusing on aerodynamics more so than any other time in their outlook on their next generation designs. If we saw that on the truss braced wing design and on the recent Airbus, at least their conceptual designs for the next generation single aisle airplanes, it's a gull wing with a high aspect ratio wing, a long slender wing. So what I was really excited about when I wrote that chapter was that I hit on a topic, the aerodynamics of the airplane, that I think is going to play a significant role going forward. So it was really exciting to write that chapter. I enjoyed it.
We've gone through at least one generation, well, really two, especially on the narrow body side. We've gone through two generations of engine only or engine led design, right? So we got to go back to the 80s for the design in the 70s for the 320. The 737 was designed in, I don't know what, like 1860 or something like that. But you get the point, right? In that you're right. It's so fascinating. You have to go back a very long time. Look, the 737 MAX, hell, the A321neo today looks a lot like the aerodynamics look a whole lot like the 707.
Yes.
And the DC-8, right? And if you think about the difference between those two very, very different platforms, all sorts of systems logic and fly-by-wire and all that type of thing. But from the pure aerodynamic perspective and the pure performance perspective, engines, bypass ratio, number of engines, durability, and reliability, and pure fuel burn.
Exactly.
Guess what?
And very similar tubes.
We just ran out, right?
Exactly.
And we didn't just run out because the science, we hit physical limits, right? Which those exist. I mean, yes, they can absolutely improve fuel burn performance, but now fuel isn't anywhere near the highest cost for airline. It used to dominate, right? Yeah. This is what success looks like. And so you're incrementing on smaller and smaller numbers, so that makes it more difficult. But the last cycle especially, we just traded reliability for fuel burn.
Exactly.
And now we're like, oh, that was too much, right? Work on that reliability. So the whole equation has shifted.
Yeah, precisely. Yeah, I totally agree. And I think, the designers today, when they're looking at the next, I don't think there's going to be any next wide body in the next 20 years, but certainly a single aisle. But when they're looking at these single aisle airplanes today, there's no doubt that they're going to want to have these engines from day one perform to spec. Now, you can argue, like, for example, if the GTF gets on the next generation single aisle airplane, that engine will already have lots of experience built in, and you can, and I've heard Pratt & Whitney say that by the time next generation single aisle comes out, that engine will be like in pristine performance conditions, improved reliability, improved durability.
Pristine's a little much, isn't it?
Yeah. Well, it depends on when, right? I mean, if it's 2040, 2045, maybe, right? That could be pristine by that point. But
I don't know that we ever would have considered the V2500 pristine. The Dash 7s maybe, Dash 5s maybe.
Yeah, exactly.
Pristine.
Yeah, and interesting, there was one, everyone's has been following Jet Zero, and, surprisingly, they've come out and claimed that they can get up to 50% fuel burn efficiency, just largely based on the aerodynamics of that platform. So a lifting body plus a very high aspect ratio wing. And then they're talking about, now I hear the latest is that they're going to put the Pratt & Whitney 2000 on it as the initial engine platform, which is, for all intent and purposes, that's a legacy engine that is not, certainly it is.
Is it in production?
The
2000? The engine.
Oh, yeah.
Is it
they're going to revamp it, but it was used for the C-17.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, I was going to say, it's for military. Yeah, okay.
So the Jet Zero blended wing body aircraft, the initial aircraft is going to be tested to the Air Force standards for a refueler, a tanker, and a tanker / cargo aircraft configuration. But at this stage, the intent is to equip it with a PW2000 engine. But nevertheless, even with that old technology engine, the lifting, the aerodynamics of that airplane are so phenomenal that just the aircraft design itself would justify bringing this aircraft into commercial applications and meet the double-digit fuel efficiency that's needed.
Yeah, so I had to look. I mean, the 2000 fits right in that gap that everybody's been talking about, right in that kind of 40,000 pound.
It is. That's what they need. And they don't have
that's
it.
What they need.
They don't have that.
GTF's not going to do it. At least I don't think the LEAP doesn't do it.
LEAP doesn't get there. GTF is a stretch to get there, I think. Right now,
you're not going to want an engine that's going to burn that hot to get there. That engine that's going to burn that hot to get there. That's fascinating.
GTF might be able to get there. I think if you, depending on what they're able to work in, I think they've designed it to maybe get there, but it's still a stretch, right? Maybe the Ultrafan, I guess, is maybe where that from Rolls-Royce.
Maybe. Interesting. I was reading an article about the blended wing body in the latest edition of Aviation Week, and they were talking about how, from a design perspective, they prefer a lower bypass ratio engine over a higher bypass. It more has to do with some of the laminar flow implications that a higher bypass engine would influence on the.
Interesting.
Yeah. But yeah, interesting. So that summarizes the book, and it was fun writing it. I enjoyed it, and it was a great experience. Yeah.
So question I have for you is, so you're now everybody has a great resource to go to find out all that information, right? Because we could just go to your book. But for you, obviously, it's a lot of different information that you didn't necessarily know everything about. So how challenging was it for you to actually go look for the information? Like what types of sources, like what did you do to be able to kind of, there were things where you're like, you know what, I think this is important, but I don't know everything about it. So I need to go look for the information. Like how challenging was that? And where did you end up going to be able to get all that information?
Well, thank God for the age of the internet. I mean, it's
He's gonna say AI, isn't he?
Well, no.
Listen, I didn't write this.
ChatGPT was great.
Yeah.
Write me a book.
We already know that's false.
Well, for the record, I wrote it all in Grammarly, so it's kind of it's not an AI app in the sense that
I use that as well.
It's a great resource.
Yeah, it truly is what it says it does. It's grammar.
Yeah. Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. But as far to answer your question, Garrick, so being a member of the AIAA, I use a lot of the resources, the papers that they have online. You can find excellent information on, for example, the concepts of lift-to-drag ratios, aspect ratios. I found out through papers that were archived on the AIAA website. Another resource was Aircraft Commerce Magazine. Unfortunately, they no longer publish any new editions, but the archives have a lot of information on there on aircraft performance characteristics, and I use their resource quite a bit. There's a couple other resources out there, but between those two, I was able to garner probably as much information from those two sources than any other resource that I've used.
Yeah. That's great. Yeah. Yeah. Which now, like I said, now we don't have to, you've done the work for everybody else, and then you just get your book. You don't need to go do the research. But yeah, I mean, look, I think and I'm, like I said, I'm getting my copy today, so I'm excited to kind of look through it. But, all the different aspects that you talked about is definitely something that for anybody that is looking to invest or advise, whatever it is, right? I mean, it's a great way to understand all the different aspects, because a lot of the times, you get into a specific field, whether it's on the financing side or whether it's from the airline side, and you understand a piece of it, but you don't understand every aspect of what it takes. And so understanding why door configurations are important, why payload capabilities are important, or LOPAs, all these different things, I think is really important. And I think the more, for anybody that's looking at kind of growing into aviation and doing all the different, like, it's a great way to understand all that stuff, because at the end of the day, right, it'll just make your job, you'll be able to do your job better having that understanding, right? And I think that's key. And I think that has something that I think has evolved over the last maybe 15, 20 years. Because I don't think we were getting to that level of detail beforehand, especially on the, I think the finance community has not gotten into that level of detail to understand the reality of what they're investing in. But I think that's changed over the course of the last, like I said, maybe 10, 15 years. Yep.
And as I discussed earlier, it's always helpful to understand from the airline's perspective why, for example, they want that thrust bump, or why they need all that D rate, or why, instead of going for a 737 MAX 10, they went for a 737 MAX 9. And
because they could get one? Is that the answer?
No, I mean, for example, we found out, and the MAX 10 is going to be a great airplane, intercontinental-wise here in the U.S. and for obviously throughout Europe, but it's not going to be optimized for a hot and high type of operation. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, it's those characteristics that kind of help you bridge that understanding, and that book kind of explains it to a level that hopefully most readers out there will grasp. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think, so first of all, this book has an insanely long shelf life, right? You'll see a bump in sales as you got geeks like me just excited to get my hands on it. But I think the true value of this book isn't necessarily people who are the aviation nerds like we are and in the space. It's the people who find themselves in aviation, on the finance side, on the project management side, on whatever, where they're professionals, they find themselves in aviation, particularly aircraft investors, banks who specialize on that finance side. And like you said, need to just kind of understand what these assets are. That book should be sitting on their shelf, right? Yeah, sure. Knock yourself out, read it cover to cover. But what it's going to be better used as is somebody says, oh, hey, we have this weird airline that's asking for a thrust bump. Let me touch up on that and really kind of understand what's going on. I think from the OEM side, just from the perspective of where I was on the OEM side, working with a lot of these people who did a lot of this analysis, day one, I would say, welcome. Glad to have you here. Read this. Period.
Yeah, and one thing I failed to highlight about the book is it's really a textbook. So as you probably can infer, Courtney, if you scan the book, it's really tailored for somebody who wants to not only just understand the material, but also get real-world experience through the examples and through the industry perspectives. And then each chapter has 2 case studies. So if you really want to expand your knowledge and delve into those case studies, there are good ways to solidify the topics in each of those chapters. Yeah.
Yeah, if you look at, this was one of the the only things that stuck with me in my flight instructor training, believe it or not, was how people learn. The pyramid, I think, whatever, you start with rote learning, which is memorization. And then there's kind of application, then correlation, then I think understanding was kind of the top. So I'm finding a lot of people who ask me about this book are like, yeah, so I'll read it and I'll know the things. No, that's kind of that base level. The application, that next level of learning, comes with the case studies, actually going through. That's how you actually learn. And then what you really want to get them to is that correlation. Okay, so now I understand this, and this is how it will apply somewhere else. That very tip-top level of understanding, by the way, where that comes from, that's writing the book, Shannon. That's yours. Yeah. Right? That's that when you teach it, right? That's the best kind of level of learning. So you get to reserve that for yourself.
Considering it as
yeah. Well, I would assume that obviously you do a lot of stuff with, through ISTAT with Embry-Riddle, right? So I'm sure that it's probably some level of interest on their part to have that as part of a reference for their students. I would think.
I haven't. Sunder, I can't pronounce his last name. He's inquired about the book and about the usefulness of it in a program like the MBA program. And what I've encouraged him to do is to take a look at it and get a sense of whether it's worth bringing it in. I'd be more than delighted to hear that an academic institution, any academic institution, would use it. That would be a strong endorsement, and I'd be more than pleased to hear that students are using this in these types of environments. So that's kind of what it was tailored to as well, to some extent. Yeah. So we'll see what happens. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, look, I think even, and I'll be sure to bring that up if you haven't done so already, but I think like the ISTAT appraiser program, to me, that's a great resource, right? For anybody that wants to get, that is interested in the program, wants to go into that field, right? Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that should be one of the first things you get so that you understand all the different nuances of our jobs to do it better, right? So
sure.
Yeah. But that's great. So if we could, I'd love to kind of get back into, you touched on a few things, while you were kind of going through the book, but, maintenance is definitely, maintenance and the value of maintenance and things like that is definitely kind of a topic du jour. Everybody that we talk to, it's all about engines. It's all about kind of extracting value from, whatever you've got. But, I think I'd love to hear from you in terms of how do you think that, I guess, that knowledge base is expanding from the investor standpoint, from the leasing standpoint, because that's something to me that's becoming, and I think we touched on that probably last time we had you on, it's becoming more and more, I think, relevant when it comes to understanding the value of the assets that you have and what happens when they're done with their initial lease. That to me is most investors will look at those and go, well, you know what, we're going to invest in the airplane and then we'll hopefully be out of it before it comes off lease, and so we don't have to worry. But that's changed because that's a very highly competitive environment. So now you're looking at, okay, well, we need to take into account what, life after the first lease to be able to potentially, take better or get up better opportunities, have better margins, right? But that also means you need to understand where the value is and how you can extract that. And so I'd love to kind of get your thoughts on like how you guys look at that today and how that understanding of the value of maintenance is expanding from your side.
Yeah. So today, when you look at the engines, we did an internal study to assess how the value of the engine today is represented overall in the value of the aircraft. And just for some context, when you purchased a 737-800 in the early 2000s, the value of the engines represented roughly about 25 to 35% of the value of the airplane. Today, when you purchase a brand new A320neo or 737 MAX 8, the value of the engines alone are upwards of 65 to 75% of the value of the airplane, the market value of the engine, I should say. And then hand in glove with that, once you get the airplane in operation, the maintenance value starts to kick in. And today, obviously, everyone's talking about the implications of the escalations imposed on LLPs by the OEMs, the adjustments to their performance restoration rates. We're completely beholden today to the guidance from the OEMs, just simply because we don't have a good sense of what the costs are. Nevertheless, if we just apply very, very conservative forecasting to today's guidance on the engine performance restoration cost and to today's projections of the LLP stack, using 6.5% escalation on the LLPs and 5% escalation on the engine performance restoration, what we see is similar to the crossover point that we saw on the half-life value engines. Let me take a step back. When you look at today, we did analysis on where was the crossover for two half-life engines relative to the aircraft value. When do you get to 100%?
Yeah, it's like, is that the 80-20 rule, right? Which it used to be the 80-20 rule. I think that's changed a little bit, but...
Exactly. Yeah. So that crossover for two half-life engines, excluding QEC, quick engine components, the crossover happens around between 8 and 9 years. So that alone should tell you that the influence of engines on the overall aircraft value is going to be much more front and center going forward. And so I don't want to speculate on what will transpire as a result of that, but you can simply make some inferences about if this is not contained, that is, when I say this, the ever-increasing value of the maintenance value of the engines and the green time value of the engines, if this is not contained to some extent and continues at these hyperinflation rates that we're seeing today, then you can certainly make some judgments about asset owners deciding to arbitrage the value of the engines at some point in time, before its economic life, maybe at year 12, maybe at year 10, who knows?
Six, right?
Which is kind of what we're seeing today.
So you might you might decide, well, you know what? I'm just going to arbitrage, taking the engines off, selling it into secondary market, parking the airplane, and that is a very realistic outcome. Now, I'm not to say that it will happen, but it's certainly a scenario that's plausible based on today's forecast. So
Shannon, we are starting to see. In fact, that was one of the topics on the JP Morgan webinar yesterday. Are part outs on, how old are these 321s, Garrett?
Well, there's a couple of different aircraft that are being parted out and on the Neo side, right? Which are, some of them are the 6-year-old Indigo airplanes that are coming out, and then there's also some of the Go First aircraft that are coming out after a couple of years of kind of being stuck there, so it's in that 6 to, I think 6. Well, some of the Go First airplanes actually are a little bit younger, but those are not necessarily getting parted out. But still, right? I mean, the current environment, like you say, you're getting more out of the engines by either selling or leasing them than you are out of the aircraft as a whole, right? So you're better off taking the engines off, finding somebody. Now, I think what people do forget is that the engine leasing side is, it's not, you're not putting these engines on for 10-year leases. These are 1, 2, 3 year leases, right? So that, I think, changes the risk profile of the deal, but you're still getting 400 plus out of the engines per month versus getting somewhere in the low to mid 3s for the aircraft as a whole, right? So that's the thinking that's going behind that.
But what Shannon is describing is kind of the long-term pressure, like the chronic, the chronic pressure to this market. What we're talking about, I think, is the exaggeration of that. Come on, they're not going to be kicking airplanes out at 7, scrapping airplanes at 7. Like that's not a number that should be in anybody's financial model.
I agree with that.
But right now, we talked about this yesterday. Right now, the first airplane that parts out is at a premium because those parts are only available OEM, right? So there's some of that. So being on the front end of that, but this isn't a question of which is happening. They're actually complementary. These are the same forces that are pushing this forward. But what I think is interesting moving forward, kind of based on what you were talking about, Shannon, is look, if we're, and we talked about this yesterday, if we're assuming 20-year retirement for aircraft, we think that 20-year will become 30-year for the last generation of aircraft for one very simple reason. Those, exactly what you said, those engines hang around longer. Yes. Like, it affects the value of everything else. So then what does it mean for the airplanes where the engines don't hang around as long? Each hour, each cycle on that engine is worth more.
Precisely.
But it also degrades the value of the airframe on which it sits because that's not the long pole in the tent.
Yep. Yeah, look, I think the more plausible outcome is that I do believe that CFMI and GTF will overcome these shortcomings in reliability. I believe that ultimately these engines will achieve the durability expectations that they're originally designed for. Now, having said that, the unknown is that once they achieve these durability goals and they remain on wing for the scheduled removal intervals, so they get to 13,000, 15,000 cycles, whatever, then the question is, do the shop visits become so cost prohibitive because there's so much material degradation owing to the fact that these engines operate in such higher pressures and higher temperature environments, internal pressures and temperatures.
Yeah, so it's not just the boss saying, you got to fly. Not that kind of pressure. We're talking core heat and pressure. I got
core heat. So thanks for the humor.
It's a really high pressure environment.
Yeah. So yes, and then the question becomes, okay, now instead of what we were projecting to be a $5-6 million first shop visit cost, is now edging over into the $7 to $8 million range, right? So now you've eroded all the benefit, not all, but you certainly eroded the value of the fuel efficiency characteristics of those engines, because on the flip side, you've got to pay an $8 million plus maybe shop visit cost. And here's what I wanted to lead up to. What kind of dynamics does that force the airline to consider? And we do have precedent. Guess what precedent it is? The CF-34s, the CF-3410s. We know that when those engines were going into the shop very much on a high frequency basis because of the nature of the regional operations, that many airlines discovered these shop visits were so cost prohibitive that many of them resorted to just parking those engines on one side and then leasing or buying green time engines, such that you effectively what you've done is you've had to orient how you manage those engines going forward. So I think that's a plausible outcome with these engines, where you get to the stage where in 5 or 6 years, potentially they can just be so cost prohibitive that airlines are just going to look to acquire green time engines or even additional spare engines just to avoid the shop visit cost on these engines. Not to mention there's the other issues related to turn times are gone up dramatically. So I just think maintenance, and I'll just focus on engines, engine maintenance is going to be a component or an issue that is going to drive their fleet strategies going forward. They may decide that flying maybe a long first run and getting out of the first lease is better than keeping these engines beyond the first shop visits because it just becomes so cost prohibitive. That is one possibility. And then The other possibility is that if they don't get the reliability up, if they don't get this reliability resolved, then obviously the implications of that, as I discussed earlier, is that you effectively have artificially boosted the value of the existing engines, and it just reinforces the airline to reassess how they're going to manage these engines going forward through their economic lives. Do they need more spares? More spares drives the value of the engines. And then that goes back to my earlier comment about, well, if you're going to need more green time and spares, there's a possibility that at some juncture, a point in time in the economic life of the asset, that the owner's just going to say, you know what, let's scrap the airplane, take the engines off, sell the green time. So
there's one major piece missing to that the CF3410 -10 suffered from that doesn't really exist today, and that's an alternative. You could, and this really hurt the 190E1 as it saw huge success on the front end and then nothing on the back half of that program. Is there's an alternative. There was a fairly reasonable alternative to that aircraft, and it was a CO and it was a NEO or NG.
Yes.
Right, for almost identical costs simply because of the maintenance. Today, the engines that are having those problems are the proverbial narrow body engines. So there is no alternative. And so they pay what they have to pay. What I'm getting to, and the reason why there is no alternative ultimately is simply because you thought I was going to say duopoly. It's not. It's just production rates, right? They just can't. Whether it be on the engines or the airframe, they just can't build enough fast enough to replace. So the only option is to put it through a shop visit. That won't always be the case, though. And this is where that math and the Garrett called it the 80-20. I think it's now the 100-0 crossover point is so interesting, because at what point is it economically better for an airline to just go buy a new airplane if it's available and take advantage of the bomb discount that the OEM got to roll all that into a single aircraft price, for which two new engines with complete time and everything are available, to which the engine OEMs are relying on the back half of that for their entire business model. Granted that I'm getting out into the future quite a ways, when the OEMs have their production act together and are delivering and allow that bubble to build. But given those discounts, why not just get a whole new airplane just for the engines at some point?
That's what I was alluding to earlier about the arbitrage opportunity. Can we reach that point? And it's a possibility. I don't want to speculate, but one thing is clear to me. I don't think that the escalations that we're seeing today, particularly on the maintenance side, is sustainable. I just can't understand how an airline can continue to manage this business with LOPs escalating at high single, low double-digit rates, and even the shop visit cost increasing at high single digits. It's just, from purely a math perspective, you can extrapolate that out and just scratch your head and go, this is just not economical. There's a couple things that will probably have to happen in order to prevent this situation from occurring, and that is they're going to have to, number one, rein in their cost and prevent these engines from being just too cost prohibitive to manage, or they're just going to have to ensure that these engines are, from an operational point of view, on a unit cost basis, exceed all expectations and match the level of time on wing performance that we saw with the 5Bs and 7Bs. You can't continue with this expectation is that, oh, we got a combustor that can go from 3,000 cycles to 4,000 cycles and in a harsh environment, and forcing, kind of as a soft time removal, forcing these engines to come off just to address a combustor issue. And then, of course, once you dig into an engine, once it comes off wing, you'll find other issues as well. That creates that sort of that uncertainty concern that an airline just doesn't want to have. I mean, I've heard airlines come out and tell us flat out they won't transition to the Neo or the Max because they don't like to deal with all the uncertainties in managing their engines. They like the predictability of the 5Bs and 7Bs, and they'll stick with them as long as they can.
But those escalation rates are just pricing. That's all they are. They're under the guise of their costs and inflation and CPI and all those have gone. They're just pricing. The reason why we're seeing high single, low double digit escalation increases, or is it like GE? They're like, no, we're single digits. We're just doing them twice a year, right? Like, oh, okay, that fool me once, right?
Yeah.
The reason we're seeing those is because they can. That is just straight pricing increase. And by the way, good on. I mean, whatever. I mean, it's just the economics. But what you're describing, Shannon, is a point where the airlines can't sustain that. They'll come down in response to that. Even if the component prices actually are higher for the OEMs to produce, those prices will come down because that's how they're pricing everything. They're some of the smartest people in aviation. They will adjust those, or maybe they'll escalate and then just discount. Who knows? Right. But the market will adjust that back. I don't think it'll come to a point where the airlines will say no, because what they'll do is they'll just take new engines and at a loss to the engine OEMs, and it screws up their business model. So they will adjust it to make sure to secure that business model. I'm convinced.
Yeah, and then we haven't talked about the implications of value. When you're starting to price these transactions with these engines today, the depreciation rate of the aircraft itself, in contrast to the escalation of the engine values over time, at some point you're going to price these transactions you can argue, to a full life, to the full life condition of the engines plus a margin on the other maintenance side, and just disregard the value of the airframe itself. Meaning you come to the point where you say, I can make money just on a full life transaction off the cash compensation that I get on the engine, plus whatever residual is remaining, and I can make my economics make sense purely on the basis of that residual value, all right, and not even account for the airframe on the future-based value. We can just disregard what the future-based value is forecasting. So it's not happening. I'm not saying it's happening, but I'm saying that certainly with the situation today, with this ever escalating maintenance value embedded in the engine, it is plausible that all these transactions many of the transactions in the future can be purely based on the engine condition at the end of the lease term, not so much what the airframe is worth. It's pushed forward from a aging. When you price an aging airplane, you price it to basically the value of the engine, right? When you're pricing a 15-year-old airplane on lease for another 3 to 6 years, you price it to the value of the engine. What I'm saying is it's going to be pushed forward.
Right. So now you're looking at doing the same type of pricing, but on a 12-year-old airplane versus a 18 to 24-year-old airplane. Right?
Exactly.
Yeah, but that does change things, right? Because then all of a sudden if you're pricing it that way, right? Does that change the risk profile of these deals where it makes them slightly less risky? Because ultimately you're pricing in, I guess it depends on how high you're pricing the value of the engines, right? But because I'm trying to think, like, if you're just pricing it based on the value of the engines after 12 years, right, then whatever you can extract from the airframe is on top of that, right?
Exactly. It's great.
Versus now where you're pricing it as the aircraft as a whole. So does that make it less risky because of that? Or
it depends
more?
on the engine type, I mean, it depends on where it is in the cycle, right? So and you're familiar with this, Garrick, where today, if you look at the future-based value curve of the engine, it's kind of escalating and it kind of flattens out, and then over time it starts to take a dip depending on the time of the engine, where it is in the engine cycle. The airframe future-based value curve is always depreciating, right? So if you have an appreciating asset like the engines that today represent a higher percentage value of the aircraft, and that's appreciating over time, you can reasonably assume that when you price a transaction, price it to the value of the engine plus any cash compensation, and like you said, anything that is above and beyond that from the airframe side and the other components is just another incremental amount of value that you can extract from the aircraft. I think it's possible some scenarios like that can happen. You're just going to price the transaction to the value of the engine and use that as a leverage to justify the transaction or justify the economics of the transaction. Or I should caveat that this all hinges on how the OEMs are escalating their airframe prices, right? So if the OEMs are escalating their airframe prices to a level where, as you know, we've seen 320neos and 737 MAX 8s, inflation adjusted, they're escalating about 2 to 2.5% per year. You contrast that with the previous decade, there was under 1%, even under a 0.5%. So that's the other dynamic that has to be played into this equation. If the aircraft manufacturers are adjusting those OEM prices year over year at, say, 2 to 2.5%, that will actually influence how that decision tree is going to evolve over time.
Yeah. Which that you raise a really interesting point. So if you're, for having been in an environment for the last couple of years where, the inflation on average, 2.5%, 3%, I think it went as high as 4 for maybe a year, but on average, right, it's like 2.5. What happens when you get to a point where production is at the rates that they were anticipating, and inflation, the year-over-year escalation goes down? Does that mean that aircraft that were purchased in the current environment at those escalation rates now need to be probably depreciated at a slightly faster rate to make up for the fact that later airplanes are going to be escalating at a lower rate?
Yeah.
Right? Because all of a sudden you've got an airplane that could be, let's say you pay $58 million today for an or $55 million for an A320neo, right? But that's been escalated at that 2.5%. Now 5 years from now, it's been escalating at a lower rate. So even though it's maybe $58 million, you're ultimately you have a more expensive airplane on the books because it was a high. How does that work? I don't know if that makes sense, but that's interesting to me.
Yeah, look, I think in the short term, I don't see that transpiring. And let me explain why. Is because if you look at the OEMs and how they adjust their prices through their escalation formulas, there's two components generally, labor and material. Labor is typically anywhere from 65 to 75% weighted in their escalation formula. And then the material component is anywhere from 15 to 25%, depending on the OEM. So let's just talk about labor today. What we witnessed over the last 3 to 4 years is we've seen labor contracts in the aerospace industry take a significant bounce as a result of the new collective bargaining agreements. Boeing getting their 38% over the next 4 years. That is starting to ripple into the indices today. So what we've done internally is we've been, because we have an order book and we have a subscription with Moody's that provides us with guidance on labor indices in the industry, what we've done is we have selectively looked at 4 labor components and derived a composite out of those labor components. So the labor components are for aerospace labor, aerospace parts, aerospace industry, aerospace parts, and then we looked at the indices that tracks those over the next 10 years. And then we created a composite. So we weighted each one 25%. And then based on that forecast, the average escalation on labor is about 3.5%, based on a very conservative forecast of that composite indices. Mm-hmm. So we think that's about right. Actually, it feels right too. So 3.5% is what we see kind of on average being the year-over-year compounded average growth rate for labor over the next 4 to 5 years. So that's why I say the short term. Yep. On the material side, we've actually seen, and we have a similar composite indice for the material, but on the material side, we just started to see sort of a tapering of the, for example, the PPI. We saw a significant bounce in the PPI during the pandemic, but it's tapered off. So the material component in the escalation formulas, I want to be very specific about that. In the escalation formulas for the OEM, is not going to have as much of an impact as it did in the past. What's going to have an impact going forward is the labor component. And if you just assume a 3.5% compounded annual growth on labor, and that's weighted 65 to 75%, while the material is roughly escalating at maybe 1.5 to 2.5% per year, you're still looking at roughly about a 3.5% compounded annual growth rate in the escalation formulas. Now, that assumes you have no protection, right? Every airline has some caps in there to protect them from that. But the manufacturer, nonetheless, still has to make adjustments in their costs to kind of reflect that.
I want to push back on that a little bit based on some things that we saw kind of last decade. And it's not the change in escalation rates that I'm worried about. Pricing. It's the actual aircraft price. So I just ran some numbers that... welcome back, Eric.
That was weird.
Just ran some numbers based on that $55 million airplane. Let's say it escalates at 2.5%. In 5 years, that delivers at $62 million. Okay, fine, whatever. If escalation is now 1.5 at that point, it's not firm fixed escalation. You're riding whatever it is with a cap, probably. Like if you're an airline and you bought it, you have a cap. But if escalation goes down, you're not paying 2.5%. You're paying the new escalation rate, which could be lower. The challenge I have with all this is that $62 million airplane that delivers based on 2025 pricing, that $62 million airplane that delivers in 2030 may be directly competing with pricing, new aircraft pricing, that is $55 million that Airbus is offering that Neo in 2030, depending on the supply-demand balance in the market. That's what we saw, bits and pieces of last decade and it wasn't so much the ebbs and flows of the demand side of the market, but production. They absorbed those benefits by increasing production. So they sold an airplane in 2015, bad example, because it would have delivered in 2020. They sold an airplane in 2010 that probably delivered in 2013. Let's say, if we're using the same math, that's a $60 million airplane that delivers, but it was $55 million in 2010 when they bought it. The pricing in 2013 for new aircraft was $55 million. It wasn't 60. Like, that was just the going rate for those aircraft. There are reasons for that. The new technology was starting to come on. But as production increases, and I know it's sacrilege to suggest that overproduction is a possibility in the way out there, right? I mean, not now. But when we're talking backlogs in the 5, 6, 7 year range, yeah, production's going to be much higher out there. How is demand going to look? And it's not the escalation at that point. It's the pricing on the next best alternative. And that's not something we've seen historically because we haven't seen backlogs this long consistently. I mean, this long. We're kind of crazy long backlogs where you've got the other idea of, well, what if you don't? You got to get in line at some point, right? I mean, there's that, it's not FOMO, but it's kind of along the lines. Like at some point you actually will miss out on just the available supply.
Yeah, no, you bring up an excellent point about the production costs. And of course, we haven't seen economies of scale revert back to pre-pandemic levels, right? So if Airbus and Boeing are able to get their production levels up to their targets, there's no question that there's obviously some benefits to that higher production rate in terms of what it costs them to produce the airplane.
Right.
Furthermore, we've seen both Airbus and Boeing becoming more vertically integrated. So they're bringing in-house the productions that used to outsource, i.e. Spirit, acquisition of Spirit. So, I mean, there's certainly an argument to be made that the OEMs can perhaps contain that production cost to a very bare minimum. And like you said, in 4 or 5 years from now, maybe it costs them on parity of what it costs them today to produce the airplane. So we won't see any bump in the values from our perspective as an investor. We won't see any bump in the values if they're able to transfer that those higher levels of production costs, efficiencies, I should say, to the customer. So yes, I totally agree.
And that's a lot of that is driven by where we are in the cycle, right? Because I mean, if they're able to get more for the airplanes because it's a high, strong demand environment, right? They will, even though they're getting more efficiency by producing more airplanes, right? But if we're in an environment where traffic is starting to slow down, demand is starting to slow down, right? Absolutely, right? That's when you start to see that pricing erosion on kind of current pricing for future deliveries to account for that, right? But
here's the business idea. Are you ready for this?
Yeah, sure.
Escalation calculations should be tossed out. Forget them. Screw them. I'm sorry. That sounds like a you problem, OEM. Like, it costs you more to build it? Hey, manage that. That's a you problem. I want current market value. Is at this number. So this configuration and these options are X% above or below the appraised current market value for what we think it should be. I want that when we get there. I'm not taking market risk for what you can produce and you unable to manage or able to manage your costs. By the way, if you don't escalate the costs, great, that's you. But I don't want to buy an airplane now that I'm committing to escalation for because you can't manage your costs when you're then selling airplanes that day for less. That's how I would align. And by the way, that would be a very short conversation because they'd be like, that's not how we do it. Sorry.
Yeah.
I want to be clear. That wouldn't happen. And then people call Derek to be like, hey, I need an appraisal. See? Drumming up business, baby.
Yeah, that would work. I'm sure the OEMs would love that.
You get the idea, right? Yeah. You see I'll call it the advantage to the OEMs on the way the current escalation calculations are built. It's protective for them, for sure, right? But there's a risk to the airlines on delivery, especially, and before it wasn't, if the backlogs aren't that long, the risk doesn't compound as much. Now we're seeing real risk in that airplane delivering underwater, simply because of the escalation that's built in and the current market value of the airplanes that they're selling, and they're okay selling at a lower price. That I don't know that will happen. It depends on the market going forward. It depends on production. But I could see some really fun discussions with the OEMs when, Indigo starts taking some of these deliveries they have in the back half of the 2030s or whatever.
Yeah, and OEMs recognize the risk to the airline of the cost implications of the aircraft when they're taking and delivering in 5, 6, 7, 10 years or whatever. And I think I'm just going to say this from personal experience, but the base point, the starting point is you need to get the baseline price.
Yeah, of course.
At least at a level that's below current market value. I mean, current market value today is already above base for every airplane out there. Mm-hmm. I'm just saying that for the Neos and the Maxes.
Yeah, wide bodies a little bit different, but on the narrow body side, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So first of all, let's leverage that.
Yeah, you're right.
And then take it from there, and then try to build in some protection, in there. But it's still risky. It's still risky.
Yeah. And I think it's also understanding the timing of the cycles, right? Because obviously you're never going to time it perfectly, but I think you do have lessors and airlines that also understand that, hey, if things are softening, or if things are where you're seeing kind of the struggles from the OEMs to get orders, let's use that to be able to place another order and then maybe get some credits on some of the existing deals that we already have, because we're placing a new order for, right? And so it all comes down to negotiation, right? So that for the airline, that's like, yeah, you know what, we're looking at taking a $60 million A320neo in 2030. We don't want to do that. So let's figure out when the good time is to go in and say, hey, we're going to order another 50 airplanes that we're going to need anyway, but we can use that to then lower our overall cost for everything else, right? Because we are able to kind of manage. So, right. And I think that, lessors do that as well. And I think it's understanding that and having the ability to do that too, right? Obviously it's not for everybody, but that's kind of understanding the nuances of the cyclicality of the markets so that you can take advantage. And, when you've made a deal and it's all of a sudden getting expensive, you can kind of adjust that a little bit to take into account the fact that, hey, we're doing you guys a favor now, so you need to help us out with these more expensive deliveries.
Exactly. And the other thing you have to manage is all the hype right now about the OEMs coming out with next generation single aisles and derivatives, for example, the A220-500. And what are the implications of that on the market values for existing airplanes? If they decide to really bring forward the next generation single aisle in the early 2030s, then that will have a ripple effect on the current values for Neos and Maxes. And if they go forward with the A220-500, which, every time you hear Airbus, they seem to give you the impression that it's a done deal, but I don't want. It's
been a done deal for what, 15 years, and the aircraft program's only been. That's one of the things that are challenging today, is to sort of read between the lines, because you're actually seeing, in today's environment, you're seeing two contrasting opinions out there about whether they're going to move forward with that or move forward with a next generation single aisle. There was just a white paper by Aviation Week and McKinsey that were saying, no, the Airbus won't do it until, 2030s, early 2030s. And that means introduction into the late 2030s. But you've heard the CEO of Airbus say, no, we're keen on bringing this forward and bringing these airplanes into the market sooner. And so you don't really have a good sense of what will transpire. What we can say for certain is that the engine manufacturers certainly are making inroads on their developments for the next generation aircraft. The CFM Rise is now going to be fully tested pretty soon on a Airbus A380, I believe.
You've got the ultrafan that's coming. You've got derivatives on the GTF that are coming out, the Advance, GTF Advantage. So from the engine point of view, you can almost argue that they'll get there sooner before the airframe does. And then the airframe can leap on that. And incidentally, I just found out about a couple days ago that, Boeing has solicited a request from the OEMs on their next generation.
I saw that. Yeah, they did an RFI.
And
right.
They did an RFI. And did you see that they wanted a variant of the ducted fan of the ride?
Oh, interesting. No, I didn't see that. Okay.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. So they're, it's, for me, it's the engine is going to leap the decision on whether to pull the plug on the next generation single aisle or not. But you're seeing quite a bit of momentum, put it that way, in the evolution of these new technology engines. So I kind of think it's going to be interesting. I don't want to make predictions, but you got Embraer out there talking about a new single aisle airplane. Ultimately, that's going to ripple into the valuations of the current airplanes as well.
Yep, exactly right. And all it's going to take is for one of them to pull the trigger on something, and then the rest are going to have to do something as well. Right. And so that's all it takes. Exactly. And if if you think about the Neos and the Maxes, if the airplanes come out in the 2035 and beyond timeframe, you've got about a 20-year production timeframe, which is about right, I think, that's okay. But anything prior to that, right, then that starts to eat into, the overall fleet, and then you've got real value degradation because of that. I think that really starts taking place if you start going 2035 and before, I guess. So it becomes a bit more interesting. And then, how quickly will airlines move to the next product if it's that much more interesting and that much more efficient, right? They'll just drop Maxes and Neos as quickly as they can if they feel that the next generation is going to be that much better. That's a big if, right? If.
But especially considering the only thing they can promise is fuel burn and economics, but what everybody's watching now is reliability and durability, which I think is legit. Exactly. So that means a slower adoption or not. We'll see where the cycle is, but the A220-500 is fascinating because I guess I don't realize what people, obviously I was intimately involved with that program and understanding what the airplane can do. And the idea of stretching that airplane does not turn it into an A320. It turns it into a stretched A220. And I'm not talking about the cross section. I'm talking about what happens if you don't put a new wing on that? What happens if you don't put an 1100, a PW 1100 G on it, but you keep the 1500? What does that mean for that airplane? First of all, it means it's a cask machine, right? It is the most economical thing by a mile that you're going to find anywhere near that sector. But the performance is going to suffer. You won't get, I say suffer. It's the trade-off, right? You're not going to get it's going to be the MAX 10, which, by the way, is a great market, right? For that airplane. It's going to be the original 321 without the ability to keep. It's what happens when you stretch an airplane. That doesn't mean that it becomes, the 3,200 mile A320 Neo replacement.
Yeah.
It means it becomes the 2,000 mile monster between 10,000 foot sea level runways. And, maybe a little bit less. Amazing, but not. And by the way to understand that nuance and really kind of understand how that would affect the overall market. The absolute first step, get this book.
Yeah.
I'm not blowing smoke, Shannon. Like, this is exactly the type of things that are discussed in here. It's that trade-off. It's that, and what does that mean for the market then, going forward? All these types of find the compromise. When it comes to aircraft performance and economics, find the trade-off, find the compromise, and then understand if it's worth it, and what the market would be given that specific compromise.
Yeah,
Agree.
And I think that's a great way to end this, because it leaves our listeners wanting more, because next time we have you on again, Shannon, for Shannon Ackert 3.0, we'll talk about, hey, this was the announcement that was made, and let's talk about that, right? Because you're right. I mean, the A225 to me is, I'll make a quick comment on that. I think what's really interesting there is that, and the reason why I think it's probably more likely that it will happen than not is you've got Airbus that seems to be pushing the A321 platform because it is so versatile.
Yeah.
And so if you look at the A320neo backlog, it's actually not grown very much. And so now if you're able to do an A220-500, which kind of goes into the short range A320neo market, and you've got the A321, right, then it allows Airbus, I think, to probably really go into that, A321neo production rate at 75% of the, it kind of moves them away from there, and they make more money on the A321s, so why not? Yeah. Exactly. So I think it's exactly. But like Courtney said, I think it depends on, do they have a new wing? Do they have a new engine type? Do they have two engines, right? Then that's a whole different ballgame, right? But it's going to be really interesting to watch.
My prediction, if they just did a stretch version, same wing, same engine, maybe a thrust bump. You can read about thrust bumps in Insights for Aviation Business Professionals. But if they just do that, the first customer where that airplane fits so sweetly and so perfectly is Delta Airlines. They love that. They don't need range on every single airplane they have. They know exactly how to use that and focus on economic.
So, but Shannon, as always, this has been an absolute pleasure. We always love geeking out with you on all this stuff. I'm so excited to get your book, and obviously anybody that's listening to this should actually go get it. You can find it on Amazon, right? So just kind of go get it. You'll have to wait 3 days, and then you'll have your next reading material for a little bit. But it's been fantastic. Your insights are definitely worth looking into and listening to. So thank you for taking the time to talk to us today.
They're worth $35. I can tell you that.
Yeah, at that price, it's like come on.
Golly.
You can't beat that, right? That's knowledge that you can't get anywhere else. So keep that in mind. But anyway, so thanks, Shannon. This has been great.
Thank you very much. Yeah, appreciate it.
Awesome.
Hello. Still recording. So everybody, this is the Time Limit Podcast with only Garrick. Woohoo! Nice. Finally got rid of him. So it's just me. Let's see, what are we going to talk about today? It's going to be great. All the guests are going to love it. So I finally did it. Got rid of that, growth that we call Courtney that just keeps talking.